Hi everyone, welcome to our World Science Connect live chat, where today we'll be talking about our World Science Festival main stage program, Science in a Polarized World, with our participant, Professor Dan Kahan. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell our audience a little bit about your research and where you work?
Sure. Well, I'm at Yale Law School, and I have appointments here in law and also in the psychology department. And the research that I and my collaborators do address the very theme of your festival this year. We try to understand why people with different values oftentimes disagree about facts that are relevant normally to public policy making. So we use a variety of empirical methods, some in the lab, some in the field, to try to figure that out.
Great. Well, we've already got a lot of excellent questions coming in, so we'll jump right in. Our first question comes from our user Politici, who asks, is the problem that people don't understand science and they get the facts wrong, or is it something else?
Well, that's a really good question. And in fact, my inclination would be to turn it into a hypothesis that the reason we have this kind of public conflict about certain kinds of policy relevant science is that people just don't know enough about the science. And then I'd say once you turn it into a hypothesis, the kinds of research that we and other people who participate in the science of science communication, we might call it, have concluded that that's not the problem. And maybe the simplest way to help people to see that is that if it were the problem, if the reason that we had conflict or the average person didn't understand what scientists do about climate change or like issues, was that the person just didn't know enough about the facts, then you would think among the sector of the public where people know the most about science, they're the most science literate, there'd be more agreement, and we wouldn't see the political polarization that we do. And that's not true. In fact, no matter how you measure people's aptitude to comprehend science, whether with a science literacy measure or a measure of numeracy, which is an ability to reason with math, or some kind of critical reasoning test, we always get this perverse result that the people who score the highest, who know the most science and are best able to reason about science, they're the most polarized. So it doesn't seem that the problem is that people just don't know enough.
And so our next question comes from our user, Mr. Dottie Hamilton, who asks, what is a fact concept that you know makes sense intellectually, but on an emotional level you can't accept or have trouble accepting?
Let's see. Well, I guess I get there's a kind of recursive quality to conflicts about facts. And so we write about facts and we study facts with empirical methods. But then we have the same problem when we try to engage the public with our science. People don't understand it just because it's good science, we think. They take positions that reflect their own cultural views. And I keep thinking, well, if I just explain my own work clearly enough, people will get it, which is kind of exactly the mistake that we're studying with our research. So I kind of get that, but I just don't accept it. I keep talking more and more about our science, hoping people will understand it.
So it gets kind of a meta belief there.
Yeah, it goes around in circles, you know. And the first time you hear somebody say, "Oh, that was a great paper. It explains why the other side is wrong," it's kind of funny. But about the 10th time you hear it, it's kind of sad. It's like, well, you know, are we really helping people this way?
Well,
But I think we are. I think we are.
Yeah, well, and we'll keep talking about that today. So our next question comes from Out of Outer Space, who asks, are people's political beliefs formed by the wiring of their brains? Is it their personalities or the people they associate with? What kind of factors are going in here?
Well, I would say all of the above. But clearly, people who have the same kind of cognitive aptitude to understand science, they could be on different sides of the issue because of social influences. And it's like anything else. Most likely, the reason people form the views they do is that those were the ones that were predominant when they were growing up, either in their household or their community. And they feel like those kinds of issues, once they're attacked, are kind of almost like a badge of membership or loyalty to a group. And at that point, their disagreements are going to be really hard to resolve. Maybe that kind of disagreement is wired in the brain. I'm not sure. But I know that it's not inevitable. There are many more things about which we don't have political polarization than we do. So this is actually an aberrant kind of thing, this cultural contestation or polarization over fact. There's nothing inevitable about it with respect to a particular issue or with respect to all the issues where you see this kind of conflict.
And our next question comes from Vane Fall. How do I identify and mitigate my own unconscious bias?
Yeah, that's really tricky because I think that people tend to realize that sometimes this sort of thing happens to them, but you never know when. All of the opinions that you form and the beliefs and understandings that you form about how science works, they have all the kind of indicia of truthfulness. They feel right. But in fact, some of them are a matter of this kind of dynamic of cultural cognition. You just won't know which ones. But if you are really nervous about this kind of phenomenon, you think it might be happening to you, my practical advice would be to find somebody you trust who seems to have the same outlook on the world that you do, but who disagrees with you about that particular issue, whether it's something like fracking or GMOs. And ask that person to explain why, because then you've at least filtered out one of the main reasons that people disagree, which is that they think it's kind of an issue of contestation between them and another group. So find another group member who doesn't have the predominant view, and at least you'll be able to have a conversation and listen to what that person is saying.
And it seems like maybe if you're asking that question, you're already part of the way there.
If you're asking that question, you're part of the way there, but it's really hard to get all the way there. Probably we need understandings in our political discourse that recognize that people are going to have these kinds of views and learn how to live with that.
Our next user asks, does the same polarization over science and facts happen in non-Western cultures? Is there data from many different parts of the world?
Well, we've been doing some comparative work ourselves, and I guess it depends on how you define the Western world. We've adapted the measures that we use to, say, Australia, and we see the same kinds of problems there. Some of the same kinds of issues in the UK or in Central Europe, Northern Europe, countries like Switzerland. So it's not limited to the United States. For sure. But when you say Western world, the connotation would be countries maybe in Asia or Africa. We haven't done any research ourselves in those areas, but I would be shocked if there weren't similar kinds of dynamics happening in those countries.
And in the program, we even talked about how different issues become polarized in different countries.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. There really isn't cultural contestation about genetically modified foods. In the United States, I mean, there was a kind of political food fight about whether to regulate them and to have labeling, but most people in the United States don't have any understanding of what GMOs are. They just eat GM food all the time. But in fact, in Europe, there is public understanding and public conflict about it. So it's kind of interesting. Why would there be differences across place? We're pretty nervous still about nuclear power. In France, they love nuclear power. They drink cooling water for breakfast. So I really don't. It's really quite interesting to see how these same dynamics can generate different schedules of risk, as it were, across societies.
And our user Montag8 asks, what is the best way to change someone's mind who disagrees with the accepted scientific consensus?
Well, probably the first thing is not to set out, especially if they understand you to be doing this, to change their mind. Because people who perceive that others are talking to them just to change their mind are really probably not trustworthy. They just see your assent to some issue as a means to an end. Better would be to be in a position of genuine friendship with the person and understanding, and maybe acknowledge to the person that in fact you recognize that there are weaknesses, even if they don't change your mind on your position. You know what the best arguments are on the other side. And then just to ask why, why do you believe what you do? And to try to initiate a conversation that might last more than just 5 or 10 minutes, but involve some kind of continued exchange and maybe activities where people do things together that are aimed at trying to figure out why people disagree. Sonia Pemberton, who's a documentary filmmaker in Australia, I think has done some movies that show how this kind of thing can happen. And definitely the first step is not to just approach somebody and say, well, I have a strategy, a communication strategy for trying to change your mind, either directly or indirectly, that kind of puts people's backs up.
And this question kind of is a nice follow-up to that. Lucy Mo 90 asks, what do you say to people who say that science is just another form of belief, like religion?
Well, I don't really say much to them because I rarely, if ever, encounter these people. Sometimes a student in class will adopt that position just to see if they can get a rise out of me or the other students. But the truth of the matter is that these are disagreements not between people who have different views about the value of science in generally. They're disagreements between different groups whose members both think that science is on their side. It's a little bit like when you go to war and you think God is on your side. Well, these warring factions on things like nuclear power or climate change or the HPV vaccine, they all think they have science on their side. So it's really not, although this is sometimes the impression people form, it's just part of the same syndrome. The people who believe in science versus the people who don't. It's the people who believe in science versus another group of people who believe in science. And there's something that is preventing the common recognition of science that's usually there for those people.
Our next user asks, does empirical truth have to be sexy for us to accept it?
Gosh, maybe that's the problem with the work that I'm doing. It's just not sexy enough. I don't think that that's the problem, although it sure helps if you have a sexy image of a brain activating when looked at with an fMRI or something like this. But I'd have to think more about that one. But I don't think that the problem's that the facts aren't sexy enough either. There are lots of things we disagree about where probably the facts and the science are pretty boring. We don't argue about the influence of living near the magnetic field of power lines, not in the United States, for example, and I don't think that's very sexy. Yet it does also divide up people in other places. So we come back to that theme of how these kinds of disputes have a cross-cultural element to them.
And our user Steve Bergman asks, studies conducted in the soft sciences, or the soft science of psychology, are notorious for their ambiguity. Are your studies more rigorous?
Well, we try to use, in the science of science communication, the same kinds of methods of disciplined observation and inference that are used in sciences generally. Are the sciences, the social sciences, more open to dispute because of complexity and ambiguity? I mean, we're talking about the physical sciences having a lot of problem with that too, with climate change and fracking and nuclear power, the same kinds of issues I've been mentioning. So if there's a problem with science being complex, it's not just in the science of science communication. And again, if it were just a matter of complexity, there'd be all kinds of things that we are fighting about that we aren't, that we just sort of take for granted.
Maybe you could tell our audience a little bit about what kind of studies you do. Are you asking people questions? Are you observing behavior? What do you actually do?
Well, we use a variety of methods. A lot of times we're using experiments where we have some kind of a stimulus, some kind of event, and then record people's reactions to them. An example might be a study we did that on people's perceptions of political protesters. We just had one film of political protesters interacting with members of the public and also with the police. But we told the subjects that the police had arrested the protesters because they had crossed the line from speech to intimidation. And of course, the protesters disputed that. The experimental element was that we told half the people in the test that these were anti-abortion demonstrators and that they were protesting in front of an abortion clinic, and the other half that they were at a military recruitment center and were opposing the policy we used to have of excluding openly gay people from the military. And people with different values who thought they were watching the same kind of protest would argue with each other about things like whether the protesters were blocking a building or hitting people with their signs. But they were also arguing with people who had their same values but thought they were watching a different kind of protest. So people who had the same values were not seeing the protesters engaging in violence if they thought it was an abortion clinic, but then their counterparts were seeing it when they thought it was a military recruitment center. So we use experimental methods like that to try to see if we can provoke people into the kinds of forms of thinking or habits of mind that generate the kind of polarization that we see. Sometimes we do work in the field where we go out and we collaborate with actors like local governments to try out different kinds of approaches to communicating policy-relevant science too. And if there's any fault in the science of science communication, I would say that it's spent too long in the lab. And at this point, it knows all kinds of things that we ought to be trying in the real world, in the field.
Thank you. And Out of Outer Space asks...
There's a lot of questions from outer space, I'm noticing.
We have a big audience out there. Talking to Mars a lot. Why do humans form tribes where the members have similar beliefs?
Well, it probably starts in the other direction. I don't think that people look around and say, well, where's the tribe that has this position on gun control and this position on climate change? And they actually just are members of those groups, most likely as a result of upbringing. The groups being ones that have different understandings of the best way to live and the kinds of social roles that ought to be part of life. And then there's this strange kind of process where that kind of identity becomes entangled in a position about policy-relevant science, at which point adopting that position and holding it and defending it from attack by other groups becomes this kind of important verifier that you're on the right side. Otherwise, people are going to question you and think maybe you're not a competent group member. So I really do think that a lot of it is the kind of reputational effect. It's not conscious, but people just perceive that if they veer off path with some of these facts that are representative of their membership in a group, they could be in big trouble. Why do they do it? That's well, I guess I would be like Dr. Evil or something like $64,000 question. It's the $64 billion question. It's not the norm. Something strange happens in the career of some kind of a public issue, and it assumes that form.
And this next question asks a little bit more about how the science is done. So Varush Taro asks, what does the current literature say about the selection of what will be researched and how that's prioritized? And how does that interact with entrenching cultural bias and policy in science?
Well, that's a good question. And there's not a big literature on what to study and what not to study. It probably just seems obvious that if there's a conflict about something like climate change, well, then we ought to be studying climate change opinions to figure that out. But the truth is that there are issues that are equally complicated that don't draw attention from people. And if you don't actually examine the kinds of risks and related kinds of facts that don't cause people to form these factions, you'll probably draw bad inferences about the ones that do divide people. For example, people think, well, there must be something about the complexity of the climate change issue that's causing people to default to their group memberships as a way to make sense of them. But there are other issues that are just as complex where people rely on their group membership to try to make sense of things, but they're not in conflict. There ought to be more literature, I think, about why we agree when we do about these complicated issues. Then we'll be able to form better inferences about what's going on when we disagree. We'll be able to avoid some of the bad, well, not bad, plausible but wrong hypotheses that people have, including that the source of the problem is that people aren't very good reasoners or they don't trust science. There have been lots of hypotheses out there, plausible ones that have been disproven. It's easier to see that they're wrong if you look at cases where we don't have the kind of dynamic that I'm talking about. But that's not nearly as sexy, just to remember one of the earlier questions from outer space. And so maybe people just naturally focus their attention on the conflicts. Nobody goes down to the highway to watch the cars driving by without crashing. So studying the issues where we don't have this kind of dynamic, not as interesting, not as sexy. The sexy question is really starting to grow on me. Maybe that is the source of the whole problem.
Well, if we helped you with your research, then mission accomplished.
Yeah, I'll test that and get back to you.
All right. So the next question comes from R.F. Saudekis. I apologize if I said that wrong. Who asks, is there any interesting psychological research about the tech industry, what they use to make us preach to the choir via social media?
Well, there's a study certain branch of the science of science communication tries to anticipate when you're going to have these kinds of problems. And a lot of times people are studying new technologies, ones that people in the general public have either little or no familiarity with, like nanotechnology. I think nanotechnology still gets to claim that it's a novel science, at least if you look at people's opinions. People don't know much about nanotechnology. We did a study where 80% of the people said they knew either nothing or little about nanotechnology, but 90% of them had an opinion on nanotechnology safety once they heard even a little bit. And they splintered into groups that are reminiscent of the kinds of factions we see on highly polarized issues like climate change or nuclear power or fracking. They probably just saw it as another kind of environmental issue. So once you suggest that there is a dispute, that there's one side that says this and another side that says that, people will start to attend to the issue more to figure out whose side they're supposed to be on than to figure out what the truth is. So people look at these new technology issues to try to find ones that are likely to polarize. But I think in general, people think that the new technologies that we have are pretty cool. They learn about something like the nano iPad, and then that affects their view of nanotechnology. So I don't think that the problem is that these things are high in technology or novel. Most of the novel technology that we're going to be experiencing is going to get a pass on this kind of cultural conflict. It won't ground the sort of perception that it's us against them.
And this next question comes from someone who encountered something in their own graduate studies that they had a hard time accepting. So Mr. Boot asks, how can a behavior be considered a crime in one country and harmless in another?
Well, there's a lot of historical path dependence, I guess. Obviously, in the United States, we consider some kinds of uses that people make of guns to be a crime, but in general, and our Supreme Court has reinforced this view, we see having a gun as not a particularly remarkable issue, and we allow a lot of people to have guns that it would be a crime to own in other societies. If I want to explain that, my inclination is to go back to the history of guns in U.S. culture. Obviously, there's history of guns being used in horrific ways to political assassinations, for example, or murder. But there's also a kind of maybe it's a folk history of the gun as a certain kind of tool with which we subdued the otherwise wild and threatening conditions of the New World. And people hang on to that. If that's not the experience they have with guns in other countries, then they're more readily going to come to understand having the sort of contact that people here have with guns, not only as abnormal, but even criminal.
And we've talked a lot both today and on the main stage program from last year about the concept of trust and trusting scientists, trusting experts. So our user Jen D asks, does it really just boil down to trust, or are there people, science doubters, who think that there are sinister, ulterior motives behind some of this work?
Well, there are some people who look at the prevalence of conspiracy beliefs and what they contribute to polarized issues over technological risks. But even they, if they're right, are explaining only a small part of it. The truth of the matter is that, as I indicated earlier, people on both sides of these issues think that science is on their side. And that's something we've tested in the lab too, is the disposition of people or the ability of people to recognize science under these kinds of conditions. And what happens is that the normal strategies that people use become confused, like when they hear telephones ringing, for example. And it isn't that one side trusts science and the other doesn't. It's that both sides are having a hard time trusting the usual kinds of clues that they use, that a scientist knows what he or she is talking about, or that scientists are predominantly on one side or the other. But both sides trust science all the time. I mean, they get in elevators and fly in airplanes and do all kinds of things that evince tremendous trust in technology. But then they have these fights about particular issues, and usually they're arguing not only about whether the source of the risk, like nuclear power, is dangerous. They're arguing about what scientists believe on these issues too. the same kinds of influences that will make people perceive different things about a source of risk, make them see different things about what scientists are actually saying.
We've got time for just a few more questions here. So our next question comes from Montag8, who asks, what's the most surprising thing you've learned in your research?
Probably the most surprising thing that we've learned in our research is that even we as researchers seem to be affected by this. I mean, you would think if teaching people about this and having them learn about it were going to cure the problem, then we would be cured of the problem. And I think I hope it doesn't affect our research, but it certainly affects our own opinions on these issues. Knowing more and more about these dynamics doesn't seem to give you any kind of immunity to it. I would have thought that we would become sort of jaded and just regard even our own opinions as not worth very much. But in fact, we fight with other people doing this kind of research if we're trying to understand what the facts are. So I guess the most surprising thing is there's no knowledge deficit theory as it applies to the science of science communication either. It isn't the case that the more you know about it, the better able you are to insulate yourself from these kinds of influences. And I'm not just talking about the research we do, but the way we behave as citizens.
And our next question comes from the Random Guru. Do you think science can exist without mathematics?
I think that would be pretty difficult. And I mean, like a lot of people, I'm a fan of Richard Feynman, and he made a pretty convincing case that if you can't get the math, then maybe you can't even get the science, or at least understand nature in the way that scientists do. I think that would be sad, and I think that the whole aim of the profession of science communication, and we have all kinds of professional science communicators in the media, for example, is to make it possible for people who have only modest understandings of the math involved to appreciate and participate in the awe of scientific discovery. But I think if you didn't have mathematics, then probably science would be pretty difficult. I mean, maybe you could draw some simple inferences like don't walk across the street without looking both ways. But most science involves a lot of math.
And this will be our last question today. So what is your most current research working on?
Well, the most current research is looking at the dynamic of science curiosity, which really is something that we did almost by accident. We were working with science filmmakers and trying to help them to see whether the methods and concepts of the science of science communication would help them with their craft. And as we did that, we developed a science curiosity measure so that they could identify the sort of people who might otherwise be interested in their movies. And it does really well for that. It predicts who's going to watch a science documentary and whether they're going to go out and try to acquire information. But it turned out that science curiosity also seemed to confer a certain degree of immunity from these dynamics of polarization. And we were pretty surprised about that because all of the kinds of dynamics of thinking that we'd looked at before, from science literacy to open-minded thinking to numeracy, they all had this perverse quality of amplifying polarization, whereas science curiosity seems to constrain it. People who are science curious will look at information which they know is contrary to their political predispositions, and they'll appreciate it. So the most surprising thing really is that there's at least one disposition, mental disposition, that seems to help people be less affected by these kinds of dynamics.
Well, thanks, Dan. This has been very illuminating, and I really appreciate you joining us today.
Sure. If anybody has any more questions, they can just send them to me by email. I'm happy to answer them.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that offer. And thank you so much for our audience for joining us and for your great questions. Our next event will be our annual World Science Festival in New York. So it is coming up May 29th to June 3rd, and tickets are on sale at worldsciencefestival.com. We'll also be live streaming a lot of events, so if you can't make it to New York, you can check out our website to find out what's available for you to watch from wherever you are. And thank you, Dan, and thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good one.